Last but not least, we get to the third theory, which again, we're going to spend the bulk of today talking about, and that is trait theory. So trait theory, or I'm sorry, traits are a characteristic pattern of behavior or a disposition to feel and act as assessed, and this is really important, by self-report, inventories, and peer reports. So traits are these characteristics that you have, or a disposition, right? Or tendency, I could use the word tendency, to feel and act as assessed by what you tell us you believe yourself to be. So a trait can be any distinguishing, relatively enduring way in which one individual differs from another. And I think these definitions make sense to me. They may make a little bit more sense to you when we get a little further in the lecture. So fingers crossed. So tests can be done to measure single traits in consumers, such as how receptive they are to new experiences. So we can measure someone's innovativeness, right? And people can be high or low or even moderate on innovativeness. Their attachment, consumers' attachment to possessions. So we can measure consumers' materialism. And their likelihood, or consumers' likelihood, to accept or reject foreign made products, which is referred to as ethnocentrism. And again, we can measure these things, and we'll talk about that further in the lecture. One thing that trait theory allows us to do is it allows us to make comparisons across people. So I can measure how materialistic a consumer is and compare that to how materialistic other consumers are. And if I want, I can segment consumers and say, hey, this product really appeals to highly materialistic consumers, or this product really appeals to consumers who aren't particularly materialistic, right? And so being able to do that from a marketing perspective is pretty powerful. So again, a trait is any distinguishing, relatively enduring way in which one person differs from another. So you could be an introvert versus an extrovert. You could also, fall high or low. We usually pinpoint people who are high or low. Although remember, traits are a continuum, so you might just be average. But there are a lot of traits that we can look at. We can look at whether or not you're slick, whether or not you're corny, whether you're innocent, if you're a fashionista. Are you popular? Are you shy? Are you sarcastic? A lot of times, when we're determining traits, we often ask people themselves questions using scale items, using a scale. And research has shown that there's usually a difference between how you view yourself and how people around you view you, which makes sense, right? I think I might have mentioned this before, but there's this famous study that's actually kind of interesting where they ask people to like rate themselves on things like their personality and their intelligence and their friendliness and all these other things. And then they asked people's friends to rate them on those same traits, right? So Bob rates himself, and then Bob's friends rate Bob. And what they find is that your friends often, or in at least this case, often rated the person much lower. So Bob would say, "Oh, I'm highly intelligent," and Bob's friends would say, "Oh, he's about average." And in some cases, they'd be like, "Bob, not so bright." Right? So, anyway, I always think that's an interesting study. So one thing to point out, researchers have discovered that personality traits are more likely to be linked to consumers' consumption of broad product categories rather than specific brands, right? So we can look at whether or not you're a fashionista and how often, you're likely to buy shoes, not necessarily how often you're going to buy, expensive shoes or shoes from a certain brand. We can look at if you're an evil person or a sarcastic person, how often you watch television and how often you watch murder mysteries if you're evil, or comedies, sarcastic comedies if you're sarcastic. Not necessarily do you watch Dateline or if you watch The Office, something like this. So I think this is a really important point. I'm sure it will be on the exam because I think it's really important. I can't stress this enough to remember when we're talking about trait theory. So they've looked at soup and soup lovers traits. So what kind of traits do people who like soup have? And this is kind of kind of interesting. I won't go through the entire slide, but I'll point out a few. So chicken noodle soup lovers tend to watch a lot of TV. They tend to be pretty family oriented. They are most likely to go to church. Tomato soup lovers tend to really like reading. They like meeting people for coffee. They like pets. I find this really interesting. I don't like tomato soup personally. I love reading. I like meeting for people for coffee. I'm not a huge pet person, but yeah, whatever. People who like vegetable or minestrone soup tend to enjoy the outdoors. They usually like trying new things, so we would classify them as being more innovative. And they tend to spend more money than any other group dining in fancy restaurants. So if you like vegetable soup, apparently you are opening your wallet for or to all the fancy restaurants. And then chili beef soup lovers. I've never heard something called chili beef before because who says that? Tends to be preferred by males. Tends to be the most social of all soup lovers. They like to tell jokes. They like sporting events. This does not apply to me at all. It turns out, although while I have grown up on chili with beef in it, and I like it fine enough, as I've become an adult, I tend to really like vegetable um, chili. I like vegetarian chili quite a bit. I make it all the time. So anyway, one thing to remember about personality traits is that we can link them to broad product categories and not specific brands. So I can say applies to chicken noodle soup lovers. I can't necessarily say that these things apply to Campbell's chicken noodle soup lovers. Marketers tend to be really interested in the link between personality traits and consumer behavior, and you can see why, right? If I can say, hey, chicken noodle soup lovers love these things, if I'm a marketer, I'm going to hone in on these things as a way to attract chicken noodle soup lovers. These people like going to church, maybe feature a church in my ads, so on and so forth. Maybe they like daytime talk shows. Maybe I put my advertisements in kind of between daytime talk shows. Like I run my chicken soup commercials during daytime talk show ads, daytime talk show breaks. So yeah. So I'm going to emphasize this one more time. In the first slide, I said that you should see a consistent reaction, right? Um, Personality traits are such that, or a person's personality is such that their response to their environment tends to be fairly consistent regardless of the stimuli. Another way to put that for traits is that since traits are mostly considered attributes of the person and not the situation or the environment, similar stimuli generally elicit a consistent response from an individual. So I'll use myself as an example. No, I don't really have kind of a external response to stress, but I have an extremely strong response to being scared, right? So I've probably seen 4 scary movies in my life, which is about, I don't know, 4 movies too many. Um, and one of them has been Friday the 13th. Every time I see a scary movie, my reaction is the same. Scream my head off, right? Like scream my head off to the point where it's almost unreal. So here's a think break for you. I know that for me, I'm risk averse and I also am kind of anti being scared. But I'd like you to think about an enduring quality that you have. Um, and then consider how your thoughts and actions surrounding this quality may differ from others, right? So what's unique about you that's been there since you've, been alive? So there are a couple of issues with trait theory. One, the orientation of traits is primarily quantitative or empirical. So that doesn't really tell us kind of the meaning behind certain traits and how people perceive those traits. So for example, if you look at the right, you see that 85% of Fortune 500 CEOs tend to be risk takers, whereas only 22% of entrepreneurs will call themselves risk takers, right? But the question becomes, well, what does each person who answered this mean by risk taking? For some people, they may have very different definitions of that term. And kind of when we take this survey and we ask people if they're takers, we might define risk taking differently than a person who is giving another survey to, let's say, college students at Wayne State. I'll give you a really good example of this. Every year they go to different states and they ask consumers, how happy are you? Rate yourself on a happiness scale. And what they find is that Utah consistently ranks pretty high in happiness. A lot of people in Utah say they're happy. And yet Utah also rates really high in antidepressant medication, right? Not saying that one means you can't be the other, but those things seem like they're kind of different. And a lot of people have come back and said, well, the question is, how do you define happiness? And so how people in Utah may define happiness may be different than how other people define happiness. But anyway, again, on the right, you see a portrait of the not so average Fortune 500 CEO, and you'll notice that they tend to rank quite high in a lot of different values relative to the average entrepreneur. They tend to be knowledge seekers. They tend to be more or exhibit more determination according to themselves. They tend to have more confidence, more creative thinking, so on and so forth. I think it's a kind of interesting group of traits. I recommend that you take a look at it. So, trait theory is really awesome. When we think about personality traits, researchers have linked traits to things like experiential buying tendencies, political orientation, meaning people who have certain traits are more likely to lean to certain parties, natural language use, preference in pets, so whether or not you like dogs or cats, the state of a person's personal living space, and outcomes such as divorce, morbidity, meaning, likelihood to die early versus later in life, and occupational attainment. So what occupation you have. Certain people with certain traits are more likely to be in kind of certain occupations. The goal of the trait approach, right, in marketing is to identify consumer traits and link those traits with a consumer's purchase interest, right? So we want to link, the type of person you are based on your traits to your purchasing behaviors. So here's a fun example of that. Researchers have found that consumers who like potato chips most tend to be ambitious, successful, high achievers, and impatient. However, consumers who like nuts the most tend to be easygoing, empathetic, understanding, calm, and even tempered. And consumers who like popcorn the most are the type to take charge. They're modest, they're self confident, but they're not show offs. So, knowing this, when you think about your own snack patterns, where do you fall on this list? So, the other issue that I'll address regarding trait theory is that it doesn't say much about the growth or development of a personality, right? It just measures differences among different people and their personalities. So let's go back to this kind of chart of unsuccessful people versus successful people. So unsuccessful people feel entitled, whereas successful people are free with compliments and are hopeful. They also are always learning. Unsuccessful people talk about people. They suspect failure. They're pessimistic. They're mean-spirited. All of these kind of things relative to successful people. But what we don't know is kind of what happens when an unsuccessful person grows. What happens if they kind of suddenly stop being entitled or feeling entitled? What happens if they start learning to appreciate learning? What does growth look like for that person? And then what we also don't know is, yes, you may be feel more entitled relative to a person who's more successful than you, but it could very well be that, your entitlement has increased or decreased. And we just don't know because trait theory doesn't really measure that in general. It's not saying that they couldn't measure that, it's just difficult. It's much easier to tell people to kind of fill out a survey and compare them across groups than it is to have that person fill out a survey over and over and over again to see if you see any growth or development in that person. So there's no real like another criticism of trait theory is that there's no real means of change because trait theory does little to kind of give us an idea of how traits develop. So yes, I can say you're more innovative than this person, or you're more materialistic than this person. But what we don't really understand is why that is the case, right? So you could say, hey, it's because of their family, but that's not always true. There are materialistic people who grow up around families that aren't materialistic. But because we don't know how traits develop, we don't really know how to change negative aspects of traits, right? So how do we do that? If person on the left, this unsuccessful people tend to be pessimistic, they tend to be spirited, they don't have any goals, they're just waiting for opportunities as opposed to kind of making things happen. How do we change those things about people if we don't understand how people became that way to begin with? And that is truly a problem with trait theory. So trait theory also has a problem with taking into account the situation and the importance of a situation. And to explain that, I'm going to talk about the difference between states and traits. So a state is a temporary way of being, right? So a temporary way of thinking, feeling, behaving, and relating, while a trait tends to be more stable and enduring and is a characteristic or pattern, I'm sorry, an enduring characteristic or pattern of behavior. So, for example, and as you can read on the slide, someone with a character trait of calmness and composure can, under certain circumstances, act agitated and angry because they're in a temporary state, right? And that temporary state might be very uncharacteristic of how you normally behave. Um, and you see this all the time with people you know or yourself, right? So in general, you can believe yourself to be innovative, but you may reach the point where there's a product or a product category that you have no intention of ever trying. You could be a person who's not really materialistic. Things don't really matter that much to you. And yet there could be something that makes you feel more materialistic within a certain situation, right? So maybe you're more materialistic around Christmas time because you want all the gifts. Or maybe you're more materialistic when you find out, you've made more money or something like this, or you have extra money laying around. Again, it could be a state versus a trait.